1.5 million children who died. So I speak on their behalf as much as on mine. My memories lay dormant for many years. I didn't consider myself a survivor. I had nothing to do with it. After the war, I was told, forget what happened to you. Nothing happened to you, in fact, and you're lucky because all the others died and you survived. So we started to build up the guilt because I survived, but the others didn't. So I forgot about it, and I didn't think that I was a survivor. And over the best part of last year, I've started writing my memoirs. And in most of my thoughts were, my memories were hazy, fluid, vague. I interpreted things the way I wanted to interpret them, seeing them from an adult point of view. And so when I was writing my book, starting to write my book, and I'll expect you all to come to the launch, of course, when I had to get in touch with archives all over the world, Polish archives, which were absolutely impossible, Russian archives. I magicked my maternal grandfather's birth certificate in Russia and in Russian, which I had to have translated. I got from my paternal grandparents' wedding certificate. I got lots and lots of documents. But when I finally got onto Belgium, that's where I struck gold, because Belgium had a government department solely occupied with keeping tabs of foreigners. It's called la police des étrangers. And everything that the foreigners were doing, whether they were moving from Rose Bay to Double Bay, from one suburb to the other, they had to register that they were leaving this suburb, moving into this suburb. Whether they were applying for a license to do anything, whether they wanted to go to a special school, or whatever happened was registered with the police des étrangers. And I was so lucky that I managed to get in hold of my file as well as my mother's and father's. So I could trace every address that my parents moved to, every request that they made for a document. There is two documents, one of me entering hospital where I had an emergency appendix. I came from one certain address. They said arrived from this address, the time, the date. And then a few days later, it's registered how long I was there and where I moved to, when I left the hospital, what address I went to. It's so easy now to put together all our movements. So that has helped me very much in my research. I was born in Ixelles, which is a suburb of Brussels in Belgium, on the day of the Anschluss. The Anschluss is when Austria was annexed by Germany, and it reunited all the German-speaking peoples. So it didn't augur very well for me. It made the Nazi bloc very strong. My family consisted of my father, Israel Kammerman, who was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it became after in Galicia, in Przemyśl, Galicia. And after the First World War, that area became Poland. So on some of my father's document, I've got born in Poland, and some others I've got born in Austria. So that was a little bit confusing. My mother was born in Biała Podlaska in Poland. We know that for sure. But apart from that, that's all we know. My mother official documents showed that after the war, I never saw the documents before the war, but after the war, my mother was a refugee from the UNO, so she never had proper documentation. And on the official document, she's registered as having been born the 15th of May, but in fact, my grandmother always contended that my grandmother was born met de eerste lichtel from Hanukkah, meaning the first light of Hanukkah. And that would be November, December. So my mother had 2 birthdays all the time, and she expected 2 presents every year. My brother Charlie, who is not unfortunately here today because he's not well, was 7 years older than me. And I had to rely on Charlie to fill in my first 2 or 3 years because, of course, I was too young and there's nobody else apart from him who've known me. By the time my second birthday arrived, the world was at war. On the 10th of May, 1940, the German marched through Holland and Belgium, the Netherlands and Belgium. And so the French had built a line of fortification between themselves and the traditional foes, the German, through the Ardennes, separating them, and it was called the Maginot Line. And they were expecting that the German wouldn't come through this time, but the German the Nazis outwitted the French, and they came around Holland. The king of the French surrendered, the Belgians surrendered. The Belgian had hoped that they would stay neutral, and so when the Nazis walked in, the king, without consulting Parliament, surrendered. That's why he had to abdicate after the war. Of course, the Nazis had invaded the east first, Poland and Czech Republic, and so when terrible stories had filtered through to Belgium of what was being done to the people in general and especially to the Jews. As the Nazis walked into a country, they applied the Nuremberg laws, which excluded the Jews from academia, social, economic. There was expropriation. People weren't allowed to own property, shops or anything. They couldn't make a living. So everybody, all the Jews realized that things weren't going to be good for them. So many tried to escape further west. And my father managed to get tickets for us, train tickets. And we boarded a train hoping to get to Dunkirk and from there catch a ferry to England where we would have been safe. But when we reached Dunkirk, it had been closed to ordinary people. The army had moved in there. So then they tried Switzerland, and Swiss repulsed us. Then we were going to try Spain and go over the Pyrenees. Unfortunately, I had whooping cough, and I was coughing, and the passeur, who's a people smuggler, refused to take our family across because I would have given everybody away. So we didn't make it across the border, and we were stranded in a little village called Sepet, which is in Haute-Garonne in France. And we stayed there for a while. My brother was working in the fields. My father was trying to do odd jobs, trying to tell. I remember very, very clearly. I remember it so clearly. I would have been 3. And I remember my father standing there, and I remember him talking to my mother in a strange language, because I spoke only French. And I said, "What language are you speaking?" And my mother said, "We're speaking German." Flemish. Flemish. She said, "We're speaking Flemish." I'm sure my mother didn't speak Flemish. I'm sure my father didn't speak Flemish. They were speaking in Yiddish, but they didn't want to give it away. And so it was just one of those only moments that I can remember being in a room with my parents. Then the Vichy government issued directives that all the people who had come in, the Jews especially, had a choice. Either they went back to their own country where they'd come from, or else they would be interned in Gurs, G-U-R-S, which was one of the first French camp in France. And my father decided to go back to Belgium. The people who were in Gurs in 1942, when the death factories were operative in Auschwitz, were shipped from Gurs to Auschwitz when it was 1942. But my father had opted to go back to Brussels. The Jews were issued with the directive. There was an organization called l'Association Belge des Juifs, or l'Association Belge des Juifs en Belgique. And that's the Association of Jews in Belgium. And that was a society fully organized by the Nazis. They controlled it. They told them what to do, what to say, what to issue. And everybody was given a force to come and register. I have the actual documents signed by my dad and by my grandfather telling them how many rooms, how many carpets, how many paintings, what the furniture was made of, whether you possessed crystal or gold or silverware. Everything had to be registered on these documents so that when they shipped the Jews away, they just walked in and knew exactly everything was catalogued. Now, the Jews were given, they had a quandary. They could register or else they could disappear. Now, if they disappeared, there would be no food coupons. So they couldn't buy any food. The alternative was if you had a lot of money and you were able to buy on the black market, that was one thing. But if you didn't have any food coupons and you weren't registered, you were in big trouble. So my family was all registered at Rue de la Seine. My grandfather owned that property. He bought it many years prior to the war. And when my grandfather, when he on his registration document, is listed as a tenant, not as an owner. The owner is a person that I've never heard of, because Jews could not own property. And so my grandfather was a tenant, and my father was a subtenant. Sublettor, or whatever you want to call it. My English is not that good. For quite a while, they were registered at that address and they lived there. My grandparents lived in the apartment, and my parents lived down the landing, the first landing, where there was no hot water. And my mother one day was carrying a pot of boiling water down the stairs, and somehow she dropped it on me, and I got third-degree burns. There was no way that a doctor could look after me because doctors were not allowed to operate. I just happened to be lucky in my unluckiness that my grandmother had a nurse who came looking after her and also eventually took her in, Mademoiselle Bex, and she mended my neck. It was very painful. So we lived there for a little while, but in 1942, when the Wannsee Conference had decreed in Germany, they had a meeting where they didn't take any notes, but it had been decreed that the Jews have to be annihilated, completely destroyed and killed and murdered, and there was no Jew allowed to stay. And they got documents to work out how many Jews were in each country. Belgium had approximately 60,000 Jews. All depends on which statistic one looks at, because the German statistics were different from the Belgian statistics, were different from the Jewish statistics. So that, it's never been able to ascertain. A very, very small percentage of those Jews were actually Belgians. Most of them were foreign, like my family, like my parents. And so my mother had been born in Poland, but had lived in England because her parents had taken her to England. My mother spoke English, and my father spoke German. They were never became Belgians. In fact, I had to, when I was 16, I had to apply to become Belgian, although I was born there. It's called adopté, and they do you an enormous favor by letting you become Belgian, although you were born there. And of course you had to pay. In 1942, the roundups started. And the roundups were they're very, very well organized. The first roundups were called razzias, and they were the Arabs who used to catch the black people and they'd ship them as slaves to America. And so the Germans thought this is a very good way of doing this. And what they did was they would come to a street and they would block off with trucks both sides of the street. And then they'd run from house to house to house. No cellar was safe, no attic was safe, no cupboard was safe. It was a miracle for anybody to survive. They came at funny times, which meant that families were not complete. There might have been a mother at home and the father looking for food somewhere, or the children playing somewhere down the street, which meant that kids would come home and the door would be wide open, mum and dad would be gone. They were left to their own devices. And these were, those roundups, they were then taken to a place called Malines, which is a town halfway between Brussels and Antwerp. Brussels and Antwerp were the two main centers where Jews lived. And so they took them to Malines, and from there, Malines just happened to conveniently have a train line directly to the east. And so they took the trains to go to Auschwitz from there. So the roundups were frightening. And what does one do when you hear about all the roundups? You try to hide your family. So I was very lucky. My father found a place for me through lots of contacts in a place called Saint near Tubize, which is very close to Brussels. It was a farm. Now, a farm is not what you expect to see in Australia, with 2,000 head of cattle. It had one cow and one horse and 6 chickens and a couple of pigs. It was a little farm, and we used to grow our own vegetables. And I was there. My father took me there and left me. I was 4 years old. I wasn't told anything. I wasn't told that he would come back. I was left there with perfect strangers in a place that I didn't know, away from my family, away from everything that I knew. And he disappeared. He disappeared out of my life. I didn't know whether he would ever come back, whether I would ever see him or anybody. I cried for days. I wet my bed. I was distraught. And the farm was run by two couples. The older couple was called Auguste and Marie, and the young couple was Catherine and Jean. Catherine was Marie and Auguste's daughter. And, of course, unbeknown to my father, they were all in the resistance. Why take a Jewish child if you're not in the resistance? I've got to tell you here that taking in a Jewish child or Jewish person or anybody was under pain of death, because not only would you be killed, but all your family, your children. So you took enormous risk by taking in a Jewish person. So I was on that farm. My brother, they found a place for him in Collège Saint-Michel, which is a Jesuit seminary. And I never knew through the war where my father and my mother were. They were registered as being 66 Rue de la Seine, but they couldn't go back there. The Nazis knew exactly where to pick them up. So my brother told me there were different addresses, but I didn't know where they were, and I couldn't have found them anywhere. I was only a little girl. So there I was living on the farm, and I had food. I was lucky. I had plenty of food, but I was very lonely. The people where I was staying used to go to church every day. Now, every day is a little bit strong to go to church, very religious. And in retrospect, I realized they were going to church to talk about what they were doing, because it was a safe environment. When the Nazis walked into a country, the first thing they did, or one of the first things, was take away everybody's radio so that they wouldn't get news and they wouldn't get information. So there were no ways of getting information about what was happening. So maybe somebody had a radio, and the whole village and the two villages would meet in the church regularly. But all the time that I was on the farm in Saintes, I never interacted with a child. There were no children on our farm, and it was too dangerous for me to be taken to play with other children, lest I let out a word that, something that my parents, Jewish, one word, something. So I didn't interact with any children, never met any children, didn't know how to interact with children. And I'd go to church and I'd pray, and I know all my Catholic prayers much better than I know my Hebrew prayers. And so one day we were at the farm, and we saw a truck coming down the hill to where we were, and out came people in uniform and without uniform, and there were haystacks at the back of the farm, and I didn't know, but one of them had been hollowed out. Maybe more than one had been hollowed out, I don't know. But Catherine took me into the haystack. She pushed me, she held me between her legs, and there was a lot of noise, screaming going on, and she held her hand over my mouth. I couldn't have said anything if I tried. I was absolutely terrified. And there she held me tightly in the haystack. But you can see through hay. When you look through, you can see what's going on. You can't quite understand it when you're only 4 years old, but you can see. On the back of the farm wall, there was a peach tree that was growing on espalier. And there were beautiful peaches, so I take it must have been around July. And they were hanging. And whether somebody got gun happy, or whether they tried to run away, or whether something happened, but I heard a gun. I saw blood on the peaches. I never saw the men. I don't know if they were shot and killed, or whether they were subsequently taken into the truck to the Gestapo. Gestapo was the the secret German police. Whether they were taken away. My focus was not on the men. I was terrified. Then the soldiers, or the men, whoever they were, started taking pitchforks. And they started looking through the hay with the pitchforks. I'm sure they weren't looking for a little Jewish girl. They were looking for ammunition, for whatever might have been hidden, guns or whatever. One of the pitchforks, the tines, hit me in my neck, right where my mother had burnt me with the boiling water. I got another one in my leg, and I've kept them as souvenirs all these years. When I had very short hair and I grew up, and people used to say my neck is dirty, and that was a souvenir of the war, but I was lucky. I was absolutely petrified. The pain, the fear. I don't remember seeing the men's bodies. I don't know whether they were shot or taken away. Another thing, I'm going to now hop towards the end of the war and come back here. Another thing that happened after the war, when we were told to forget everything that had happened to us, I never went to thank those people. I never went to thank those people who had saved my life, who had hidden me, because I was told to forget. And when I went back when I was an old adult, the whole village had changed. It was an industrial complex. I went to the church and I asked the young priest, I said, I don't know their name, but he said he couldn't identify them. There was no way. So I lit a candle and I thanked them in my heart, but I was never able to thank them for saving my life. The women then decided that they couldn't look after the farm by themselves without the men. The men were taken away. And I don't know how I got back to Brussels. I really don't know whether they took me back, I don't know how they could communicate with my father. It would have been extremely dangerous for my father to have come to Sand, because Jews were not allowed to travel. And on his coat he would have had the Star of David, which Jews were forced to wear. So I can't remember how I got back to Brussels. What I do remember is that I was walking with my father. Maybe it was when I went back, maybe it was a few days later. I can't actually chronologically say, but we heard footsteps, soldiers' footsteps, heavy footsteps. And my dad pushed me into a doorway behind the door, and he held me in his big black coat, and we were both trembling. And I will always, always remember the smell of his big black coat, the smell of fear, the smell of he couldn't do anything, the smell of how do I protect my child? And I have always been frightened of everything. I'm frightened of my own shadow these days. So I put it back to those years. I know exactly which doorway it was. I know the street. It's Rue Camusel, which is perpendicular to Rue de la Seine. So I would think that my father was taking me. 66 Rue de la Seine appears right through my life story. We were going there because Rue Camusel was right around the corner. And when I went back to Brussels, I went and had a look at the house, which I always thought was a big house, and it just looked quite small. When I got back to Brussels, I didn't stay in one place. I was moved from one place to another. I hadn't seen my mother. In fact, I didn't see my mother from the time I was sent to the farm in 1942 until well after the liberation. So I presume it must have been an organization that was looking after children, and somebody would come one day, take me by the hand and move. Whilst I was in the farm, I had 2 dolls, one that had no legs and one that had no arms. And those were my only toys, the only toys that I ever played with the whole time through the war. And later on, I acquired a tea set, which I have now donated to the museum. And I have a photo of myself. At the back of the photo, it's the name of a photographer in Saintes, where I was hidden where the farm is, with my 2 dolls, and we'll show it afterwards. And that is the only photo of me taken during all that time. So when I see all the people now taking photos of all their little kids, every movement, I'm thinking, I've got one photo for all the wartime. So I started moving from one strange place to another strange place. And I was so well trained that people would come, I would take a coat, I would move. I would go to strangers, I would go with anybody, because that's what we were told. Our clothes, we were growing up, our clothes were exchanged for other people's clothes, moved from safe house to safe house. And it was just, you lost your personality. That is during that time that I lost my 2 dolls. And I had nothing but somebody else's clothes. But at one stage, my grandfather managed to negotiate with the Massons, who were my grandfather's accountant before the war, Monsieur and Madame Masson and Mademoiselle Masson, to take me in. And so I went to the Massons and stayed with them. Mademoiselle Masson used to have visitors, Nazi soldiers. I was always told that she didn't do it for the stockings and the chocolates and the liquor and whatever she was getting, but because she was working in the resistance and she was quizzing them about troop movement, about what was happening with people who had been arrested, who were in jail, where they were, if somebody made an attempt to go and find them. That's what I was told. My brother said nothing of the sort. But he was 7 years older than me, and they saved my life too. They hid me. When Mademoiselle Masson had visitors, I had to jump in the cupboard and be very, very quiet. I had scabies, and that's very itchy. And I also had lice, and I was frightened of the dark. And I was in this very dark cupboard that was creaking, and I couldn't let it creak. So I'm frightened of the dark. I'm frightened of my own shadow. So my father used to come every fortnight and bring a little loaf of bread, of real bread, because we had a relative who had a bakery, far distant relative. And my father used to bring me a little loaf of bread. And it would have been at such great risk, impossible risk, to bring me this silly little loaf of bread that I had to share. I hardly got any of it. I shared with the maçons. And he risked his life. And I couldn't tell him, don't bring me the little bread, because... And that's when my father was arrested. The Allies got D-Day when they landed in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. My father knew about that. Obviously, he would have known. And 3 weeks later, if he could have hidden for another 3 weeks, if only 3 weeks, my father was caught in July, and he was taken to Malines. And I have, which I'm going to show you afterwards, I have one page of the manifesto of my father being loaded onto the 26th convoy, which was the very last convoy out of Belgium. And my father's number 241. And recently, a few years ago, actually, my brother gave me this ring. And I have a photo of my father wearing it on his little finger. And this is the only object, the only thing that I have in my life that belonged to my father, that my father actually touched. I haven't got a shirt, a jumper, nothing of my father, nothing to hold on to. But I know this ring is his because I have a photo of him as a young man wearing this ring. And my brother felt that I should have it. And I treasure it because it's the only thing that, the object, apart from the emotion, the only real object that connects me to my father. Then 1944, September 44, July 31st, the last convoy left, arrived in Auschwitz. Nobody was tattooed with a number, straight to the gas chambers. Straight to the gas chamber. Never had a chance. It wasn't, no triage, no sorting out who lives, who died. Straight to the gas chamber. I tried to get in, when I got in touch with the Auschwitz Museum. I've been to Auschwitz a couple of times subsequently, and they have absolutely no record of my father. I have the record of him being loaded onto the cattle train. I've got his number. I've got everything. And not only that, but the authorities, the Belgians who collaborated with the Germans, with the Nazis, ticked so many times, each one, whether you moved from this spot to that spot, ticked to make sure that you went onto the transport. It was the last transport. 26th. The liberation came September, Montgomery with the Tommies, and my brother found me at the Maçon, came and got me. And we were running after the tanks, and the soldiers were throwing pieces of chocolate, and my brother shared the piece of chocolate with me, and we were both so very ill because we hadn't had that type of food ever. And there were still snipers. All the people were joyful on the street marching, and the snipers were shooting, the Nazi snipers were shooting from the building. And what did they do? The Belgians ran up the buildings when they could find the snipers and threw them down. You know, it was a sport. It was I didn't understand why we were celebrating. I kept on asking my brother, when is my father coming back? And then we started going to the trains. And my brother took me every day to the train station, La Gare du Midi. And we were waiting for the returnees to come back from the camps. And there were living cadavers walking. Many of them were still in their striped garb that had been given by the Nazis, looking gaunt and terrible and frightening. And even when they found family, they realized the enormity of what they had lost. There were no joy for reunion. It was terrible. They'd come off the train. And I asked my brother, I said, Charlie, is Dad on this one? Is Dad coming back? Is he on this one? Is he on that one? And every day we went to the trains together. And every day my dad never came back. And at that stage, my mother moved, and Police des Étrangers recorded that Madame Kammerman moved from there with Charles Kammerman, with Francine Kammerman. But Israel Kammerman had been arrêté par les Allemands, arrested by the Germans. Subsequently, I obtained a death certificate for my father from the Belgian authorities, and they had the cheek to write on it, "est mort pour la patrie," saying, died for the fatherland, for Belgium. My father didn't die for the fatherland. My father died because he was a Jew. So that's my father's death certificate, which I have, that the Belgian issued. We moved into a one-bedroom apartment, my mother, my brother, and I, in a place called Rue du Ezel, which is right at the next to the King's Palace at Laken, and that's where we lived. The King was not in residence; he was still in Germany with his friends, and we moved. There was one toilet for 4 apartments. In the whole building. We had one bedroom and one other room, and we had one sink. In the sink we did all our washing and washed ourselves, our clothes, the dishes, everything, the vegetables. That was how we lived in. And at that stage I was just roaming the street. My mother found a job with the NAFI. And the NAFI is an organization that entertains the British troops. And she found a job. In fact, that's why we moved in to Laken, because it was at Palais du Centenaire. And that's why, to be close. And my mother was working at the NAFI. I was roaming the streets. I didn't know my mother. When I first met up with my mother, we didn't know each other. And for some reason or other, my mother didn't want me. My mother never bonded with me. She did not want us, my brother and I. My mother had found newfound liberty, freedom. She'd been under the thumb of her father, and then she married to an older man, and here she found herself free for the first time in her life. And my mother didn't want us, didn't want me. So I don't know what happened to my brother. I don't know. In that time, I saw him from time to time, and then I didn't see him. When we were in the Azores, sometimes Charlie would come and cook me a meal, and it would always be the same. Would be chips with an egg on top, a fried egg on top. Quoi? I went to my grandparents. My mother couldn't look after me. My grandparents then took me in. Somebody had given me a cat, a newborn little cat. I didn't know there was a difference between boy cats and girl cats, so I called my cat Natasha. It turns out that it must have had a real problem with personality because it was a boy. And my mother said, get rid of it. But my grandparents said I could bring it over because my grandmother had mice in the garden. And so she was happy to have a cat around. And I was also sent to my grandparents. My mother didn't want me around. And so I moved in at my grandparents. And my grandparents couldn't really handle the intractable, difficult, naughty, wild child that I was. My grandfather used to scream at me, chameau. Anyway, they told my mother they couldn't mind me. So between 1945 and 1950, I went into foster care. And lots of different old people. This wasn't organized by the government. It wasn't controlled by the government like it is in Australia, foster care. Where I was, it was old people trying to make a buck. And so there I was with lots of old people. When I became too naughty and too difficult, they'd chuck me out and they'd find another couple would take care of me. When I was nearly 8, one of the foster carers decided that this is surprising, this kid is not going to school. I'd never gone to school. Nobody thought of taking me to school. So he took me to the school, Rue Jean de Bien, and left me at the door. That was mid-term, mid-year, mid-everything. All the other kids were already into the routine. I didn't know what a school was. I didn't know there were kids and teachers. I didn't know what was happening. I had dirty, horrible clothes. A lot of clothes came from my English cousin, Rosalind, but the shoes were not very good because Rosalind had very thin feet and I had very wide feet. But I made myself a lot of injury on my feet. And so the carer left me at the door and he said, go in. And I went in and the kids were laughing and anyway, an older person came over and asked me what I was doing, and I said, I've come to school for the day. And so they said, can you read and write? Can't do anything. I could count, because in the winter, Catherine had taught me how to play solitaire. And you can't play solitaire unless you know counting at least until 13 or 12 or whatever it is. So Catherine had taught me how to count. And I became very, very good at maths. I think that's what my grandson takes after me. And but I couldn't read. I couldn't write. Nobody had ever taught me, nothing. So they put me in the class with littlies, 3 years younger than me. I was the butt of the laughter of the whole school. The little ones would laugh that this big girl couldn't read and write. The older ones my peers would laugh that I was so stupid that I had to be with the little ones. So my schooling years were very, very sad, but you may not believe this, but by the time I finished primary school, I had caught up with everybody, and I was selected to go into the highest level of education, which is Greco-Roman, at school. Schooling in Belgium is free, and private lycées were paid for if you felt you had to go to a lycée. You could go and the government would pay, because I was what is called an orpheline de guerre, a war orphan. So my mother by that time had remarried in 1958. No, when were you born, Helen? 48. And my sister was born the year after, 49. And I was called back to move in with them. So I was in 1950, early 1950, I moved in with my mother and my Morris and my sister. And I looked after Helen. Helen was my child. For many years, Helen didn't realize that I wasn't her mother because I did everything for Helen, apart from feeding her at the beginning, which I couldn't do. But apart from that, I took Helen everywhere. Wherever I went, Helen went, and wherever Helen went, I was there. And I love her very much. She's not my stepsister, she's my sister. And when even going to school, I took Helen to school by the hand. When Helen was sick, I stayed away from school. I had to look after my grandparents. I had to help in the house. I had to help with Helen. I was Cinderella. This is my new name, Cinderella. Although we've already got a Cinderella in the family. So there were many years of neglect. And I got to Greco-Roman. I was chosen to go into the high level where all the professionals go. If you wanted to do law, if you wanted to do medicine, if you wanted to do any subject, worthwhile subject, you had to do Greco-Roman. And I told my mother I was so proud. And my mother said, "No, you can't do that. You can't expect my husband to support you." Excuse me. And so my mother sent me to a typing school for 6 months when I had just finished primary. And it's called L'École Funk. And I did 6 months of shorthand typing, and that was the sum total of my Belgian education. I found jobs. I found great jobs. Every year in September, I found a job straight away. But unfortunately, in June, I had to give notice because I had to help my mother on the markets at the coast. They did the coast the whole summer, June, July, August, every day a different market. And they needed me to work for them. I wasn't paid, but I did steal some of the money, surreptitiously. And what did I do with the money, you might like to ask? On food. I would sit in a cafe called Stassano. Do you remember Stassano? And I would sit there eating ice creams by myself, all alone, just eating 1, 2, 3 ice creams or a yogurt. That's what I used to steal the money for, because I had been so hungry at times that the only thing that gave me some sort of consolation was food. And so that's, you can see, it's been my lifelong ambition to make it stayed with me. My grandfather passed away in 1958, and my grandmother had family in Australia. And so it was ideal. Helen was just old enough to go into a pensionnat, boarding school, and so they didn't need me. It was time to get rid of Francine. And so my aunties and my mothers decided, without consultation, I knew nothing about it. They applied for visas for my grandmother and me, and they shipped us to Australia. My mother all this time never said, "I love you," or "hug me." I spent 2 nights sleeping with her in London in a bed, the same bed, and she never hugged me. And so I arrived in Australia. We came second class, and on the Orangi, which was a very good ship because it had been used as a troop ship by the Australian Army. And we arrived in Australia, my grandmother and I, and when the ship pulled into Sydney at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I saw the beauty of the place where I was finally going to go, it was just so wonderful. The sun was shining. The harbour was just so magnificent. There were little boats, there were fishing boats, there were these beautiful homes with gardens and trees, and I found my harbour in Australia. And do you want me to finish? Okay. I've seen my mother, my sister, and Morris came to Australia in. My brother was here before me. And my mother, Morris, and Helen arrived in 69. They're all 49, 59, 69. And I made my peace with Morris. I've got to tell you that when Morris moved into our home and he was sleeping in my father's bed, and I kept on thinking my father was going to come back any day now. And, of course, he never did. But I never went to sleep one single night without praying that my Morris would be dead in the morning. I hated him so much. It was a terrible burden to carry all this hatred for so many years. So when they arrived in Australia, I made peace with Morris. And I realized that he didn't wish me any bad. He was a man who took me in when a lot of other men didn't want to marry my mother because she had appendages. She was in love with another man, but he knocked her back because she had 2 children. And Morris took me in, and I realized that I owed him so much. So we made peace, and we got along very well over the last few years, and he couldn't. Morris's way of showing love was to give food. Again, food. So every time we went, he would stuff us with the most beautiful delicacies, lots of beautiful food. And so I associate that. And it was wonderful to have Helen back, to have Helen and me to be sisters again because we hadn't been together for so long. And I got married. And I have the most wonderful children in the world, and I've got the most fantastic grandchildren, each of them a pearl. They're absolutely, I couldn't wish for any better children or grandchildren. When my mother was dying, I looked after her for the last 6 months of her life. We all took turns, my brother, my sister, and I, going regularly. We'd feed her, we'd force her to have ice cream, we'd pour it down her throat because she didn't want to eat anymore. And she had dementia, and she didn't know any of us. I'd say, "Mom, Mom," and she wouldn't look because she wasn't Mum. When you'd say, "Minnie," yes, she was Minnie. She wasn't our mother. And I'd say, "Who am I?" And she'd say, "The nurse." And what I wanted so much was for her to say just once, "I love you." She didn't. And that's...
I'm just going to get Francine's presentation up and she'll just tell you what each picture is.
Non, je dois expliquer ce qu'il y a là. These are only a few images that my grandson second grandson helped me select. But when you all buy my book, you will get lots of pictures and lots of documents.
I don't know why I can't get it to open.
Oh.
Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay.
That's my mother and father when they got married. In later years, one day I showed my mother that picture of their wedding, and my mother said, "What a beautiful man. Who is he?" This is my birth certificate. I'm born in Belgium, but I'm a Polish. And this is, you're going very fast, Aviva.
Sorry, no, it's going on its own, automatically.
This is our family before the war. That's my mother, my father, me, and Charlie in Blankenberg. Doesn't look like me. That's my dad and me. My dad, this is the last time we were together. That's Boba. That's me. That's the photo of me with the two dolls in Saint. This is in Saint. I'm wearing my brother's pants, which he wore to a wedding and which were cut down. And there's my dolls, one with no leg and one with no arms. And that's the church in Saint that I went to every single day for 18 months. And that's my dad, number 241. This is the page of my dad's, the manifesto that he was. Can you see all the ticks, how many times it was ticked to make sure that they boarded the train? This was the 26th transport. And this is Malines, where they used to unload the Jews out of the trucks, waiting for their shipment to Auschwitz. And this is where it says "Arrêté par les Allemands." You know, at that stage, this is a monument in...
Sorry. It's just...
This is on a monument in Belgium, Kamerman Israel, which is in Brussels, where they've got all the Jews that didn't come back. This is my grandmother, grandfather, my brother, and I after the war. I don't seem to smile much on any photos. And this is Helen and I. Helen when she was 18 months. And I. That's me in the typing pool. My great big accomplishment. And this is my first pacer in Australia with my family. Yeah, that's Edie. My first pacer in Australia. That's my wedding. And that's my handsome husband. And that's the first group of child survivors. First time we met. Yes. And then subsequently, what I didn't tell you is that I went to university and got 2 degrees. This is my first degree when I got my bachelor. And later, this is my family. These are my special people. Thank you all for coming.
To the Holocaust survivors that are here today and to the museum members, I always find it really hard to talk after these remember me's. Francine, you've made me cry. You know, you can read books and you can learn about history, but when you actually hear somebody tell their story and you visualize it and you see a little girl, and I think of my grandchild at 4 years old, you know, it really brings it home. It really makes us understand what the Holocaust was all about. And everyone has their own story, but the hardships and the heartache and the lasting impression that all left. And our Holocaust survivors are all such wonderful people to be able to come in and share their stories, because it's these stories that make it so real for the school children. They come and hear these stories, and that's what they take away. And that's what they tell their parents, and it suddenly becomes a reality rather than just a page of history. So we thank them for the wonderful people they are. This Remember Me series has been so amazing. There have been one story of after another, all of these miraculous survivals. So we thank Francine. I'll give you another hug for all those you never had. I'm sure if you, Francine, if you write your book as well as you, if Francine can write her book as well as she tells her tale, I'm sure there are many, many volumes to be sold. One cannot imagine she didn't have a formal education, because she speaks so beautifully and so eloquently. Please look at our website. We have so many amazing events at the museum on an ongoing basis, and I'm so proud that we've become the cultural hub that we have. We have Tom Fisher talking about his book on Sir John Monash, called Maestro John Monash, on the 6th of August. We have the Korshak commemoration on the 9th of August. We have a book launch of Israeli and Australian politics over the last few years. There's an amazing movie towards the end of August. Honestly, we have so much to offer. We really value those who are members, those who join us on a Sunday. Please come back. Please join us at our upcoming events. Your support to the museum and the museum itself is invaluable. We hopefully are able to impart the important lessons that are here to be learned. I thank you all so much for being here today, and please give Francine another round of applause. The reason we give you all a card today, and we call it Remember Me, is that Francine's picture's there and just a little bit of her story, and Francine has signed the back. And we ask you to take it home, and in a quiet moment, there's a place for you to put your signature, which will say, I will remember the story, and I will pass it on. So please remember Francine. Thank you.